I'm going to focus in on a podcast series that actually it was a bandmate of mine that turned me on to it. He said, "You're going to love this." Whatever people suggest podcasts to me all the time, and there's only so much time in the day to actually tune into them. But he started describing this podcast to me, and it was based on Joe Nocera. He's a New York Times journalist, and this is like a true crime type of podcast. And I'm not super into the true crime stuff. It seems all sort of fantastical to me. But given that this is a real situation, and then when I got the information that there was a therapist involved who was taking advantage of his client and seemingly getting away with it, and to an extreme, I got interested. So this is a podcast series, and it turned into an Apple TV series with Will Ferrell and Paul Rudd playing the main characters. It describes this 30-year relationship between a psychiatrist named Isaac, or he's called Ike Hershkopf, and a patient of his named Marty Markowitz. So the psychiatrist, Ike, he slowly but surely took over Marty's life during the period that Marty was seeing him as a psychiatrist. And he convinced him that Ike, the psychiatrist, was the only thing that was keeping him alive and well, or standing on his own 2 feet. So it was in the early 80s. Marty, the client, was in his late 30s, and he was recommended to Hershkopf, the psychiatrist, by his rabbi. They're both Jewish and both involved in the Jewish community. Marty was running this family business that he sort of was left at his feet when his parents died. And he didn't really know much about business. He was kind of a pacifist, let's say. He wasn't a really wheeler and dealer at work. He couldn't really rah his employees. So he just kind of kept this business afloat. He was really, he was a good financial guy. So he was frugal with money and spending, but he couldn't get this business going. It was just this sort of dead fish in the water kind of business that was barely floating by. And he had inherited the business, like I said, from his millionaire father and mother, both of whom died. So there are family members in this business. There are people who've been working for his father a long time. This guy, Marty, started feeling really overwhelmed by the company responsibilities. There were family issues because he was having trouble parsing what to leave at work, what makes it home in terms of tension. His fiance left him during that time. And of course, he was upset with the death of his parents, who not only left him the business, but also made him the executor of the will, made him the sole beneficiary of an offshore account, who, left him in charge with doling out responsibilities, tasks, and money to people in his family. So the way that this guy, Joe Nocera, found out about Marty and the psychiatrist, who I'll get to in a minute, he went to a party. He moved into this house in the Hamptons in New York, and he went to a party next door. He was invited by a guy who said, "Hey, if you want to come over for this party, a very important psychiatrist is throwing it, and it'll be a blast." So the journalist, Joe, goes to the party. I'm getting a little bit meta here. And he sees it's lavish. There's a pool party. There's good food. There's a nice koi pond. It says Ike Hershkopf on the mailbox. That's the name of the psychiatrist. And come to find out, after he's talking to all these people, he talks to this guy kind of doing maintenance stuff around the house. He said, "Well, this is a pretty cool party. This guy Ike must be blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this is a great house." And the guy who was doing maintenance said, "Actually, it's my house." I said, "What? It's your house?" So this guy in scrubs, out doing all of the mechanistic kind of work, well, this was his house, even though the name on the mailbox said that it was a psychiatrist's house. The psychiatrist was convincing everybody at this party that it was his house. What happened is the psychiatrist, Ike, gradually convinced Marty to let him take control of his home, to take control of his company. So he would do things like, first of all, he would say, "You're too much of a pacifist. You're too passive. You're letting people walk all over you. Let me help you get these people in place. Here's what you say to them." So he helped him set boundaries. That was tier 1. And the guy was like, "Wow, this boundary setting thing is really helping me in my life." Next step was, he said, "Well, let's set boundaries by, if people still tread on you after you set them, get them out of your life. You don't need them. You might think you do, but that's the old pacifist you. Remember when your life was crumbling? That's the old you that let your life get out of control. The new you, just get these people out of your life. And so he started doing that. People who he felt like, burn off the dead wood. You don't need these people. They're just bringing you down. Until he finally convinced him, Marty's sister, who actually was one of the people who talked highly of the psychiatrist or told Marty that he needed therapy. She was getting a little concerned about their relationship. Like, he's getting way too involved in your life. So the psychiatrist said, get her out of your life. Take her off the will. And he listened to him. Because slowly and gradually, this guy Marty was thinking, everything this guy said so far has made my life better, so I should listen to him. He actually got so far as to Marty became a consultant in his business, and then convinced him that Isaac, the psychiatrist, became a consultant in Marty's business, and he convinced Marty that actually you should make me the president of the company. That way, all the hiring and firing, if you're too scared to do it, I can do it.
Now, I just want to jump in. That's against the law.
Well, yeah.
Has nobody reported? Didn't anybody report him to the psychiatry police?
I don't want to give too many spoilers about how the way that the thing ends up, but I can say that by the end of the podcast, there's a pending case against him in order to lose his license. But he did do it in a way that you would imagine like a really high profile attorney might plan it. Like if you're going to scam somebody, he was very, very attentive to detail and let's say generalities in the way that law was constructed or the code of conduct was constructed to he could be vague enough to say, well, I didn't do whatever it was. There were accusations against him. So he stopped being his psychiatrist for a while, or at least he claimed to. And when he stopped being his psychiatrist, then he became a consultant of his company. Now he was just a guy that Marty relied on for his life, that he was once a patient of.
Was he still working as a psychiatrist?
I think so. It sounds like he was, and it sounds like things were informal at that time, but it sounds like he was still giving him therapeutic advice. And after all, he started off
as a psychiatrist for other people. Was that?
Oh yeah. He was still working as a psychiatrist for others. So I can't get into. We could.
This is reminiscent of. There's the Nexium. I mean, just everybody knows addiction wise, spousal abuse wise, making you strip away all your other connections is a bad sign. So that's for sure dependent on you. In Nexium, that kind of sex, whatever cult, in all those cults, they make you separate yourself from your family so that they're more dependent on you.
There you go.
That's a bad sign. It's against the law to become involved in a client's business before, during, or after your therapeutic relationship.
Part of the incredible, it's like watching a car wreck or listening to one, I guess, this is a podcast. Part of the incredible part of this is the entire time you listen, you think, well, he can't do that. And this psychiatrist really took it to, kind of like Donald Trump, I guess you'd say. It's like, well, people say you can't do that, but let me just do it and see what happens. And so he did it without consequence for a long time. There were subtleties to laws and requirements and restrictions that in the podcast it details. So I can't talk about it. I won't talk about it here. It'll be interesting to listen to. So he finds ways to dig himself out of legal holes all through the thing while he's scamming his patients. And actually, you'll hate this, but it's the most interesting part. The one thing that this client Marty was reluctant to do was get his sister out of his life. His sister was like the family that he had left. And not only was it his sister, but his two nieces, his sister's children. So when he said, well, your sister's got to get out of your life, he kind of was saying, oh, you've been right about everything and you're probably right. But it's just that even if she was out of my life, my nieces, they rely on me. They're like my children. And so he had this way for Marty to actually be passive in a way. He had him write a letter to the children of his sister, so to his niece, that her principal at the school said, hey, you're needed in the office. so she could open this letter that was detailed and said, I'm terribly sorry. You know, my love for you is undying, and you're like a child to me. Unfortunately, your mother has double crossed me, and as a result of this, I have to, you can't be in my life anymore. None of you can be in my life anymore. So he excommunicated this part of his family from his own life, and now he was so isolated that it was self-fulfilling. This guy Isaac Hirschkopf really was like
the most famous example of a therapist getting into business with his client and he lost his license, does that ring a bell with you? A genius who had a lot of problems was Brian Wilson, and his psychologist, I think his name was Landy, started writing music with him. But of course, nobody's interested in Robert Landy's music. It's Brian Wilson. And
the Beach Boys.
They took his
right.
license away because
that's right.
Not allowed to be in business with your client. So the larger issues we're talking about is A, this is a professional violation. B, this is the way that all addictions, interpersonal addictions, cult-like addictions take place, stripping, and it's reminiscent of partnership abuse where you strip away all the connections for a person. We talked about the woman who committed suicide. That was one of our podcasts where her boyfriend withdrew from her. And before he did that, he made it impossible for her to have any other friendships. And so in a way, it's an addiction because the person becomes complicit in their own isolation. Marty allowed this to happen, which made him completely dependent. And so it's like a drug, so much like a drug addiction in the sense that the person's actively taking steps in some way to force themselves to be addicted.
In a way, that one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because as I was listening to it, and then I watched the series, which is good, I thought of Love and Addiction the whole way through. I mean, this person really did become reliant, dependent on, addicted to this relationship with a psychiatrist. You touched on this. Let me ask a few questions that get us to the larger issue. How, just psychologically speaking, in a person's mind, in a person's life, how does this happen? Because you could think about, you addressed, well, this is, first of all, it's not legal. You shouldn't let this happen. But let's just say that we're a vulnerable person who needed therapy and is being pulled and dragged along. How does this occur? I mean, how does a person let this happen to their life?
I mean, even in Love and Addiction, we kind of give rules. Like, obviously it's a bad sign if your partner says, well, stop having, don't talk to your mother or your sisters anymore. And so it's a danger sign. I mean, obviously, most people aren't at this extremity. And we're saying, to what extent does your lover, your partner, tell you to strip away things from your life? And to what extent do they encourage you to engage in life? That's the telltale sign of the difference in a relationship. I mean, we could talk about, there's Robert Nussbaum, head of Nussbaum was a woman who got involved and lost her job and was abused by Robert Stern. Was that his name? I don't want to use somebody's wrong name. And eventually they sort of adopted a child and he killed the child, and the head of Nussbaum allowed that to all happen. And people had a hard time dealing with that. She was abused. She left her job. She had been stripped away of all her relationships. So she's a victim, but she was there and complicit when the child died. So then the question becomes, well, at some level, she's an adult and she was like put in prison for, at the same time that everybody was saying, for God's sake, she's a victim, and her face was distorted with being beaten. You have to hold the person accountable for allowing this child to die. And in the same way, you have to hold it accountable to the person for allowing their life to be taken over. There's a certain ethical distinction here. to be a partner in your own victimhood.
There's the most interesting part for me of the entire series was that in his later part of life, 30 years later, this person decided enough is enough. I mean, 30 years of going through this guy throwing parties at your own house and taking
Marty, 30 years later.
But Marty, 30 years later, finally did what Isaac Hirschkopf said he should be doing to all these other people, back to him, cut him out of his life, took him off. I mean, he was the, what would you call it, joint proprietor on overseas accounts. I mean, this guy had just as much access to Marty's money and Marty's family and Marty's things than Marty did. And actually, he made him a lower tier person in that world. So Marty actually, in a way, outgrew his addiction to therapy, which for me begs the question, all right, so there must have been inklings along the way, periods of discomfort that maybe this isn't right. And I wonder, could you reflect, what are if you're a client, what are the signs you could be looking for that you're in too deep or over-reliant on therapy?
Well, I naturally pick up on the natural recovery thing. They did, a lot of people quit smoking. And then they did a whole monograph, the Department of Health and Human Services, people who don't quit. And they couldn't find a distinction between people who didn't quit and people who did quit. And they also found that people kept quitting all along. And you sort of said, well, what the hell's the matter? They didn't stop smoking when the cancer report came out. They kept smoking for 10 years, but then some of them just quit at 20 or 30 years. And then when they said, well, let's look at them, they must have been more dependent. They must be more dependent on the nicotine. They must be more psychologically bereft. They couldn't really find explanations for that. So one deduction from all of this is there's no such thing as a person who's too far gone to be able to extricate themselves. That's the main lesson of this. 30 years of having sacrificed his life. And that always happens in these cults where, the person's been in the cult forever and then they leave it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, from a standpoint of being, if you're testifying in a court case and somebody says, well, they couldn't leave the addiction, then you say, well, people leave addictions all the time. And often you can find that what I would do therapeutically, and you may bring up a good point, Marty must have been clicking on some of this himself all along, expand that little portal with the person. Was there ever any point where you got out of this addiction for a while? It's like with smoking, you find a person quit smoking for 2 years and now they're smoking again. They go, wait a second, or heroin. You quit for 2 years and now you're back. So A, how to quit, and B, you sort of knew you should quit. You've got all the ingredients inside of you already. Let's just talk about how and why you did that before and try and generalize that to the here and now.
There were several points along the way. They did this in a dramatic fashion in the TV series. The reporter explained it really well in the podcast series and actually interviewed Marty. There were several points along the way where, every couple of years or so, there would be some move that seemed so radical, and it was the psychiatrist, that Marty would come back and say, what the hell, get out of my life, this is it. And the psychiatrist would say to him, oh, can't you see this is just some of that tension built up from when your mother, blah, 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 blah. And he would get Marty to say, oh, I'm sorry. And the psychiatrist would say, oh, I forgive you.
It's like quitting smoking and going back to it. And in a way, I've often said interpersonal addictions, therapy being one and love being another, are, supposedly you have a heroin dealer who's kind of talking you into taking heroin. But by and large, nobody cares that much. Mm-hmm. Certainly with smoking, nobody's trying usually to keep you addicted. So when you're fighting that addiction, all you're fighting is an object. In a love addiction, the woman who, killed herself, she's fighting a guy who's using some kind of wily methods for keeping her dependent on it. And Marty's, the psychiatrist, is a perfect example. It's almost, well, they've got this extra tool where they can say, oh, can't you see while you're trying to leave me that's all based on your psychiatric problems. And so when I talk about love and interpersonal addictions, which both of these fall into, they're the worst addictions, because you have an object we might even think about the psychiatrist's psychological need to be dominant.
Mm-hmm.
He might be saying to himself, like Landy, the psychologist, saying, I'm such a great therapist. I've taken over. I've helped this guy do everything. He loves me because I am the greatest therapist. And it's great to have confidence. But when that's dependent, in every kind of a dynamic like this, there's a subjugated person, there's a person who's subjugating them. But each of them is getting a psychological need fulfilled that they can't find fulfilled in any other way, even though one's dominant and one's submissive.
Absolutely. Yep. That's so well said. Could I pull it back from less relationship sort of addiction, love kind of addiction, or interpersonal, to modes of therapy? Because I think that we've made the case before, you certainly with AA for decades, and we've recently sort of talked about how MAT, or medication for opioid use disorder, could be this way. There are therapies that involve really beneficial components. AA, for example, has this sense, it's free, has a sense of community. You can find a meeting anywhere. You can talk to people who are in a similar situation as you've been in. Yet we hear so many stories about people who have felt so roped into Alcoholics Anonymous that they felt like they were supposed to be in it, and actually dismissed as a person if they ever left it. And similarly with what do they call it now? MOUD. There are these properties. You get a clean, legal supply of a drug that's more or less the kind of drug that you prefer. And so you're using drugs kind of like you would normally use them, but safer. But then we've heard a lot of stories about how people feel like, oh, geez, I have to make a choice between my drug of choice and this medication. And
or you're told by the therapy itself that you can't, one brand of methadone therapy tells you have a metabolic disease and that you can't get off the drug.
Right. And even let's even go best case scenario, just so we can totally steelman it. Like the place that Samantha worked for a long time, she actually no longer does at this clinic. It was actually celebrated if somebody was able to wean off of and not take methadone anymore. Actually, people wanted that and supported it. But so often, just as our colleague Aaron Ferguson has said, people would stop showing up to get their methadone, even though it was a safer supply than what they were getting, because of the hurdles to get it, the requirements for you to be able to get it, to show up to certain meetings, to have urine analyses done on you, to things that didn't really have anything to do with you living a good life. So anyway, that's the other struggle.
They made it harder or easier. I mean, because you could look at that as being, people have an impulse to get free of the addictive therapy like Marty did.
Right.
And sometimes the way they do it is just to cheat and just say, that's it.
Yeah.
And so the bad side of that is, well, would Marty have completely collapsed, or does the methadone person say, well, the hell with that, and I'm going back to the street? Or is that some kind of self-cure within the dynamic of a therapy?
Mm-hmm.
How would you, have you ever been in a situation where you were an outpost for somebody who was in that kind of a therapeutic relationship, where they were looking to you for some kind of support for extricating themselves?
I'm sure, yes, but I can't think of a specific. Are you imagining?
I had a brand of doing that. So at some points in my life, I would have a certain number of clients who would say, I don't know why I'm in this anymore. I don't like it. And so I've done therapy for people getting out of therapeutic addictions. That's
okay.
I've had. I've certainly done therapy for people who are getting out of love type addictions. So one general thing to say is it's more or less like getting out of any other kind of addiction. In terms of evaluating therapies, what we talk in LPP, we work with people who are in MAT, And, people are saying, well, it is safer. You are getting a guaranteed drug supply. But the essential element that we always give is don't label your own self as being the better part of yourself as being the therapy. This is all about you. You're in charge. You have to be in control. All of the issues are, well, how am I going to end up being the best human being I can be? That doesn't necessarily mean you should stop taking the medication, but it does mean that the criteria you're evaluating against is who am I, who's in charge, and where am I headed? Those are the bottom lines in all therapy, both for the individual and for us as a society saying, well, how good is or useful is this kind of therapy?
So let me put it another way. There is a vulnerability that a person could have, and there's a type of person who I can imagine is so vulnerable that therapy, that just the introduction to a therapeutic relationship, it probably does feel like a lifeline at that point, and even reasonably so. The trick is, are you going to live the rest of your life feeling like therapy is your ultimate lifeline? And so when you get a person who's just feels like their life is crumbling and then they enter a therapeutic relationship, that initial hit of, I have a little bit of warmth and help and maybe even a path forward and hope. How do you suggest, when you do that kind of work with people, that they get beyond that and start looking at their own lives?
How do you help them to reflect back? I mean, the issue is, how do they reflect back on that experience as being increasing their own self-efficacy?
Right.
And
right.
That's what motivational interviewing is about. That's what the Life Process program is about. It's a reflection on your own strength. And I believe you and all the other coaches in LPP understand that that's what the goal of the therapy is, to have the person think back on their own connectiveness, their own power, empowerment, and their own agency. That's what we're supposed to be about doing with a person. If you're in a therapy, you should be asking, are they helping me do that? If you're seeking a therapy, you should be seeking a therapy that does that. And if you're an outside evaluator, that's what you're looking for. One of the fundamentals in motivational interviewing is enhancing and reflecting on person's own agency. That's what that's all that emotional behavioral therapy is about. CBT is all about that.
So let me flip that on its head. If I'm in that person with that sort of dynamic where I'm feeling like half of the work of my life is me, half of it's the therapeutic relationship, or that's the thing saving me, what are the signs that I am building self-efficacy rather than the question that I asked initially, which was, how do you
another question to ask is, how do you know that your therapist is helping you to do that? Is your therapist reflecting on his or her greater glory or on your greater glory? Obviously.
No, go ahead.
Well, obviously the question is, are you taking more control of your life?
Right.
And another way to evaluate that is, if you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, if it's your child or your spouse, you have to be asking, which, Marty's sister was asking, you have to be asking the question, is this therapy enhancing their ability? You can't just be saying, oh, AA is great for my sister. She stopped drinking. You have to say, is my sister in greater control of her life and her dealings with me, her own children, or whatever, or my brother? Are they taking greater control of their life? Which gets back to, it's our interpretation of harm reduction isn't, did they stop taking the drug? We're not abstinence oriented, or even did they stop taking less of the drug? The issue always is, are they better connected and better capable of managing your life? That's the bottom line that we're looking at.
So that is what I'm getting to. We can it's easy to rightfully, Ike Hirschkoff is the villain of this story, right? But you could take away the person, and you could just think about modes of therapy in general, or like you say, it's an addiction. So why not just replace that with any sort of object, any sort of relationship, any sort of involvement. So just a therapeutic relationship in general, whether it's to a person or whether it's to some sort of a program, the key feature of that program that should show you that you're moving forward in your life is, do you have more control in your own life than you did before entering that program?
And there's a positive takeaway from the Marty situation and from the people who escaped Nexum. People do it all the time. It's like, well, you should have quit smoking when you were 20 or 25. Okay. That water's under that bridge. Now you're 50 or 60, quit smoking now. You can do it now. And so Marty, you can say, well, what a hopeless addict. 30 years, his whole life is gone. He's given over his business, his house, and he's lost his sister. You're never lost. You're always able to redeem yourself and extricate yourself from that kind of an addiction.
Spoiler alert, because I can't resist telling you that I think one of the things that pulled Marty back out of to be able to end this therapeutic relationship was that he reached out to his sister, who sort of miraculously, after all this time, allowed him back into her life. And one of the first things he said was, "Hey, I just want to let you know I'm going to make you, co whatever of the will again." She said, "I don't give a shit about the will. We haven't talked. Let's just talk." It took him a long time to re-involve himself in the now adult niece's life. She was very resistant. She remembers that letter that she sent him. But the fact that he had family that he had cared about that whole time, and was sort of convinced, despite it depressing him, that they shouldn't be in their lives because they were going to ruin it. That family and that connection that we're able to take.
So we're talking about. I actually consulted with a guy whose job is extricating people from cults. That's his thing. And time again, he was seeking some inputs from me. Time and time again, I'd say, I'm afraid everything I'm going to tell you is something that you already are practicing, you, the therapist,
right?
Getting yourself from cults, which is why he turned to me, because he recognized that it was an addiction. But, it's the same process, which it really gets back to a general point that we're making. We're not in the addiction business. We're not in the suicide prevention business. We're not in the cult extrication business. We're in the self-enhancement, self-empowerment, and self-agency business.
I should use that quote and put it on a back of a car like a bumper sticker. Do you have any other reflections on this story? It's just, for me, before I let you run on that, it was just, it's out there. It's on people's minds right now. It's a very popular show. And people have various reactions to it. In mine,
what are some of the reactions people have to it that you hear about?
Well, mostly there are a lot of what we said already, but a lot of it is talking about how can this happen in psychiatry. It goes down the road of how do you put stoppers on psychiatry to make sure this malpractice can't happen. And that's fine. I'm more interested in, who this client and his own self-empowerment and how he could have interrupted this process along the way himself. And
now, another topic that we've dealt with, which is very similar to this, we did the childhood stars who get roped into, some of them get into drugs and alcohol. But of course, the most famous one that's just happened, she's just broken through from her father. Is his name Jamie also? What's her name? Help me.
Are you talking about Britney Spears?
Britney Spears.
But I don't know what his name is.
For some reason, I've just been reading about her this morning. And Marty got into this hole on his own, but Britney Spears started out as a little girl and they were putting her through her paces.
Yeah.
They had her. They trained her. And I think her father's name, Jamie, he had a drinking problem and he needed her to make his living. His whole identity was predicated on her. And they started when she was, 5 years old. So in a way, on the one hand, there can be more understanding of, how did that happen? She was brought up that way. On the other hand, it's remarkable that quite a large number of women that we've mentioned, have, Drew Barrymore is one we always mention. Um, um, the woman who's become California sober, what's her name?
Demi Lovato.
I mean, there's so many that, and you would think, well, how could they ever do it? Because it's sort of like they were on training wheels. They were trained into this addiction to feel that they needed somebody to manage their career, their diets, their finances. And a remarkably large percentage of them still escape that.
Isn't that funny? Because I think what you're saying is, if anyone should not be able to escape that, it should be those people who are conditioned early on
from 5 years old.
That's their lives. You're right. This is your life, and that's so similar to a cult.
Sort of get disgruntled and start saying, "What the hell's going on here?" By the way, one of the things New York Times had a front page article about Britney Spears. She really likes to dance, and then I was reading this other thing. Even when she became a Disney kid or whatever she was, all the other kids said, well, she really knows how to dance. Let's get the moves from her. And even when she was being mind controlled, she would run her Las Vegas shows. She would teach everybody the dances. So one of the points, having one great strength in life, having a purpose, getting appreciation for a skill is one of the greatest anti-addiction mechanisms. Even when Britney Spears was being controlled, she was in charge of the dancing. And in a certain way, one way to look at what's happened to her is that she's generalized out from that control in her life to getting control of her overall life.
Okay, so we've talked about the shrink next door and how that can happen to anybody. It doesn't have to be a therapeutic relationship. It could just be relationship, or it could just be some sort of addiction that we all could sort of understand. And again, we talk about fundamentals of how to think about one's own life, their self-efficacy, their self-reliance, so that they can sort of understand when a relationship becomes overpowering, whether it's to an object or a person or a mode of therapy. Fair reflection, summary?
Very good. And, you can always get out of it, and the therapy should be about, and you should be about reflecting on your strengths. You're stronger than you think.
All right. Thanks again, Stanton, and happy Sunday and happy birthday to you.
Great to be with you on my birthday. Bye-bye now.